Before I begin my presentation, I would like to recognize that I am currently on the stolen, unceded territory of the Semiahmoo, Katzie, and Kwantlen communities. For this project, I wanted to do something focused on the 319 bodies that were recently found on reserves here in BC and in Manitoba. In respect to the 215 Indigenous children found buried at the site of a residential school in the Kamloops, a memorial was displayed in Vancouver of 215 pairs of shoes, each representing one of the children that were found. My presentation today is on walking along the path towards reconciliation for Indigenous communities in Canada. The first Big Six concept I will talk about is historical significance. How do we decide what and whose stories to tell? My first example is the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees basic rights and freedoms for all Canadians. The Charter was established in 1982 and was supposed to enforce the idea that all Canadian citizens are equal, no matter their race, age, gender, religion, and mental or physical ability. We focus on the fact that this charter protected the rights and freedoms of Canadians, but in reality this did not apply to the First Nations peoples. The charter was included in the Canadian Constitution in 1982, yet the last residential school in Canada closed in 1996. Basic rights and freedoms were not given to the Indigenous communities, who were still forced to leave their rightfully owned land and were forced to assimilate to white European culture. My second example for this idea is relief camps, or unemployment camps. During the Great Depression after World War I, relief camps were put in place to create jobs for unemployed men and give them food, a place to sleep, and work for 20 cents a day, which is about 1/10 of what they would get if they were employed with a real job. People may see the relief camps as a good idea that gave the unemployed men after the war jobs and a roof over their heads, but it was not a great experience for many. It did not make sense to put money into creating these camps instead of using the money to work towards creating a better employment program that would help unemployed men find actual work that they could use to support themselves. The men were exploited because their only other option was being homeless and hungry. Also, just like these camps, Indigenous peoples had to stay on land reserves with horrible living conditions. Unlike the relief camps, though, Indigenous peoples were forced to go, not voluntarily placed in the camps, and they could not leave if they wanted to. My second Big Six concept is evidence. How do we know what we know? My first example is residential schools. Residential schools were created to completely erase Indigenous culture by assimilating Indigenous peoples to white European culture. Children from the ages of 3 to 16 were taken from their families and forced to attend residential schools. Children were physically and sexually assaulted, and many children died. The large number of recorded deaths is increasing as more and more previous reserves around Canada are finding the buried remains of children. We now know that trying to erase an entire culture by forcing children to attend awful schools that did not let them express their culture in any way was inhumane and disgustingly wrong. The fact that it wasn't originally seen that way is unacceptable. Even though residential schools no longer exist, the trauma and damage caused by them do exist and will always exist. The long-lasting problems caused by residential schools have left Indigenous communities suffering from poverty, poor housing, poor education, and no reconciliation for the land and children unrightfully stolen. These schools were horrible places that stripped Indigenous peoples of their identities, and finding the bodies of the 215 Indigenous children was added proof to the horrifying things we already know about these schools. My second example for this idea is Japanese internment camps. After Canada helped the Allies in a war against Imperial Japan and the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese Canadians were seen as spies and were sent to Japanese internment camps in BC, Alberta, and some even in Manitoba or Ontario. Families were broken apart, their land was forfeited to the government, and they had to deal with awful living conditions in these camps. In the past, Canada has unfairly moved racial groups into places with poor resources and living conditions and taken their land from them. These camps further prove Canada's quite recent history with racism against minorities, and it is unacceptable. The third Big Six concept I will talk about is continuity and change. Does change always mean progress? My first example is the Indian Act of 1876. The Indian Act of 1876 enforced laws that aimed to strip Indigenous communities of their rights and freedoms and to completely remove Indigenous culture. It was a racist and unfair act that has induced violence and trauma for Indigenous communities in Canada. The act forced Indigenous peoples to live on reserves. It banned all religious ceremonies, including powwows and all traditional dancing, and it allowed colonizers to force First Nations peoples to assimilate to white culture. Over the years, the Indian Act went from harming the Indigenous communities in Canada to keeping what they have left protected. Over time, the Indian Act enforcements did get better for Indigenous peoples, but Indigenous peoples are still discriminated against and at an automatic disadvantage in Canada. My second example is the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion. Expanding the Trans Mountain Pipeline is a mega project that will cost Canada $12.6 billion. An oil spill from the pipeline would cause irreversible damage to the First Nations environment. Even though it could benefit the economy, people believe it may not be worth the risk of permanently destroying our environment. The decision to go through with the Trans Mountain Pipeline was not a step in the right direction of reconciliation. The government disregarded First Nations environmental concerns and is trying to go through with the construction of the pipeline for economic opportunities. The fourth Big Six concept is cause and consequence. What are the causes that are hidden from view? My first example is corporate expansion and domination. Corporate expansion is the growth of a company through hiring more employees, opening more stores, and growing its brand name. Some examples of corporate domination are big brand, multinational companies like Apple, Google, Amazon, Coca-Cola, and McDonald's. Huge companies' main focus is the revenue, and all of the biggest brands use some sort of exploitation or unethical business for their products. These companies damage the environment for economic advantage and disregard concerns from Indigenous communities, but they do not advertise that side of the business and they keep it hidden from their customers' view. My second example for this idea is the Alaska Highway. The Alaska Highway, which goes from Dawson Creek, BC to Fairbanks, Alaska, took only 8 months to build during World War II. It was a race between the American and Canadian sides to see who could get more done first because it was during wartime and they wanted to get it done as fast as possible. The highway was built through First Nations land, and they were able to construct the highway in such a short amount of time because they ignored the environmental and cultural damage that would come from it. Indigenous peoples were not consulted with the decision of going forth with the highway that would destroy their land and harm their culture. We've allowed a pattern of ignoring concerns from Indigenous communities to continue today. For example, they have not been consulted with the recent destruction of old-growth forests. The fifth Big Six concept is historical perspective. How can we ever understand the past? My first example is paying for war. During World War I, Canada had to find ways to raise money to pay for the costs of war. Greater production farms were established by William Morris Graham on native reserves in order to produce more food and profit from it. W. M. Graham also forced Indigenous people to work on these farms and lease their land to non-native citizens. Graham made these farms intending to help Canada pay for the war, but he profited off native land resources and stole from the Indigenous communities. He justified his actions at the time by saying he was helping Canada pay for damage, when really he used his white privilege to take land that was not rightfully his with no consequences. My second example is Wilfrid Laurier and immigration. 7th Canadian Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier encouraged immigrants to move to Canada to increase the population and create a stronger nation. He managed to get almost 1 million people to immigrate to Canada by promising them land with good resources. Indigenous communities felt more displaced with the incoming immigrants taking over their land. Laurier strengthened the nation and made a huge impact in Canada by increasing the population, but at the same time he disregarded the history of the land and who the rightful landowners were. The last Big Six concept is ethical dimensions. What do historical injustices and sacrifices mean for us today? My first example is the Chinese Immigration Act of 1885. The Chinese Immigration Act stopped almost all Chinese people from immigrating to Canada. All Chinese immigrants were required to pay a $50 head tax, which eventually was raised to $500, put in place to discourage Chinese immigrants from moving to Canada. This is one example of pure racism due to European Canadians' desire for a white Canada, which is unreasonable and wrong. A white Canada was also the aim when assimilating Indigenous peoples to Euro-Canadian culture. Unfortunately, we can't change the past, so now we need to do as much as we can to give back to everyone who is affected by the prejudice and racism in Canada's government system. My second example is concentration camps. Concentration camps were created to eliminate Jewish people and people who were not of the desired Aryan race in Germany under Hitler's socialist leadership. Jewish people were starved, tortured, and killed in these camps. It is not okay to abuse a minority group and blame them for things they had no control over. The hidden deaths and murders that occurred at residential schools all over Canada were a genocide, similar to the horrors of the Holocaust. We can now recognize that this is not okay and should have never happened, but it did happen. What we need to do now is spread awareness of the hateful events that occurred and try our best to reflect and find ways to try to fix the damage and trauma that was caused, even though the pain will never fully be forgotten. In conclusion, Canada needs to take many, many steps to even come close to making up for what they put the Indigenous communities through. It's angering and saddening to learn about Canada's awful past towards minority groups. Many Canadians are shielded from the full truth about Canada, and it is unacceptable. Indigenous peoples were treated so unfairly, it truly infuriates me to read about the hateful and horrible events that occurred not too long ago. The last residential school closed in 1996. The oldest students who graduated from the schools that year are only 41 years old. These events were recent, and we have to recognize this. Since I've started this project, 73 more bodies were found at reserves in Saskatchewan. 392 bodies have been found so far. 392 children, added to the thousands that were recorded, never made it back to their family. The number keeps going up. We must give back to the Indigenous peoples who were forced to go through the sickening events due to Canadian colonizers. We cannot ignore the past any longer. Finally, I want to include this video from Global News of one of the Kamloops residential school survivors. I want to include a warning that this video may be painful to watch.
When he tries to talk about the memories from more than 4 decades ago, it's evident how much they still haunt him. Douglas Hyson Eustache told us he wanted to open up about his experience as a student at the former Kamloops residential school after learning about the children's remains found nearby.
I didn't know there could be little kids that were buried there, and it broke down pretty bad. I was there from 71 to 75, and I could hear my friends and that crying, getting dragged downstairs, whatever.
Eustache's story is a tragic testament to the trauma tied to the country's colonial past, and the recent discovery here has reopened wounds so deep he says he can't sleep at night. He told us he wanted to share his story, but it brought up so much pain he was unable to continue his interview with us.
I wanted to get out of there so bad, but I was raped and abused mentally, physically, sexually, and all that. I hear about all these kids that might be my family over there buried too. I can't do this.
He's wearing a neck brace, he says, after being assaulted by strangers on the streets, who he says hurled racist slurs as they kicked and punched him. But recovering from that beating, he says, pales in comparison to his attempts to heal from childhood horrors he's been reliving in recent days.
This racism is not just in the past. It is rooted in our government system. Settlers were and still are the problem, and I encourage everyone listening to review and reflect on your privilege and find a way to move towards reconciliation for Indigenous communities. Here are my references. Thank you for listening to my presentation.